Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of comics like Damn Them All, The Flash, X-Men Blue Origins, Uncanny Spider-Man, Coda, and the upcoming Hellblazer, Dead in America. It's Si Spurrier. Thanks for coming on, Si.
I'm exhausted just listening to that list of...
You know, I have to admit, there's this feeling I had in my head where when I was putting that intro together, I was like, I feel like I'm missing something.
Oh, Jesus, welcome to my everyday. Sit down at my desk and think, oh, crap, what have I forgotten? I'm supposed to turn something in today.
It does seem like you've had an unusually busy year or busy stretch or something.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it's been awful. I say that in the knowledge that it's a privileged position and plenty of people would give a left nut or equivalent to be where I am. But about this time last year, I was coming to the end of quite a busy period and then and needed a break, frankly, as we were jamming just before we started recording. You know, I've got 2 young kids. There's a lot going on in the real world. I just needed a bit of a break. And then I started getting offers of work, and each one in isolation was the sort of offer that would trigger that part of the brain that has said to itself, I'm not going to take any more work unless it's something really special, the sort of thing that I can't say no to. And then there were five of those in quick succession. And by the time I was saying yes to the 5th one, I was sort of chewing my own knuckles off and hourly sending my wife apologetic emails because I knew how bad the next 6 months were going to be. And they've been pretty tough. I think it was the right thing to do because I would have hated myself if I had turned down the chance to do more Hellblazer or more Coda, and the Flash thing was too much of a wonderful opportunity to avoid, and so on and so forth. All of these things were kind of dream projects in very different ways. I just wish they had come over a course of several years rather than all at once. Because, I mean, it's false economy. You try and do a year's worth in 6 months and you'll end up taking a lot longer than 6 months because the things that you think will be quick won't be quick. They'll be incredibly slow. You'll end up having to redo things because your brain isn't working. I'm not sleeping anyway because of the bloody children, and round and round and round. It's been a lot. So you find me waffly, though I of course am in a state of sort of shell-shocked, if not quite trauma, then something like because it's all finally winding down. I'm now in a position where I'm just working right now on The Flash and Hellblazer and not looking for any more work until I've had a little bit of a sort of recoup and relax over the holidays.
It's interesting. I feel like it's been a pretty consistent theme on my podcast this year where I talk to writers in specific who either intentionally or accidentally have found themselves in a position where they're kind of at their breaking point in terms of workload they can take on. And I don't know if that's kind of a reflection of the state of things. And for listeners, I'm gesturing everywhere. Or if that's opportunities popping up. I mean, some of the people who I talked to who were like that were like Ram V and Joshua Williams and stuff like that. So people who are higher up in terms of like the hierarchy of writers and everything. But at the same time, it does feel like there's some boundaries being tested and a lot of writers are being like, whew, I think I've reached my apex. This is what I got.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that and a lot to unpack as well. I mean, because tired and grumpy and Friday evening and a glass of wine in already, the sort of the real politic of it for me is that, especially with the sort of the big two, the kind of work for hire side of it. I don't know that this is policy, by the way, and if you get the right editor, then you're laughing. But it is unusual that you will definitely get another / better job when you finish the one you're doing. Nobody's reaching it, it's not like the VIPs are reaching out to you to say, hey, great job on this, it sold really well. When you're finished and when you're ready, there's more work waiting for you. That's just not happening, certainly not to me anyway. And so it doesn't matter how high up the ladder this elaborately contrived notion that we all have, which in practice doesn't really exist, but let's go with it for now. It doesn't matter how high up that you climb, the sweaty anxiety of nobody appreciates me, nobody wants to employ me after this one, I'm fucking up all over the place, oh God, whose hand do I need to kiss in order to get the next gig? It's just constant. And you think that's going to go away. You're remembering that first gig you got, and oh God, my foot is finally in the door, it's all going to be gravy from now on. And it isn't, because every single step, the horizon just goes a little bit further away and a little bit further away. And if you're very lucky, as I have been, you can pursue the joint ambitions of playing the career game, doing the kind of work for hire, big two stuff, which you can absolutely enjoy if you can find the hooks, the ways to enjoy it, the way to make it feel valuable. But mostly you're doing it because it's the game you have to play. But also the other track is finding value in your work, whether that's in the big two stuff or the creator-owned stuff, whatever it is. So you're exercising both the creative ambition, but also the sort of needy optic ambition, where you need to feel like you're being seen to be succeeding, seen to be climbing this tree. And I think that latter is a parasite that we should all despise and decry, but it's so difficult not to listen to it, because I think we probably still do live in a world where if you spend 6 months writing Batman, whether it's a big pile of shit or otherwise, after that, you can go and tell whatever stories you want in the creator-owned world, and they'll sell extremely well. Suddenly, everybody's listening. So it's not the case that if you write the most searingly beautiful, valuable, important thing, and it gets drawn by a wonderful artist, and it's just a beautiful artifact, it is not enough to say everybody's going to read it and everybody's listening. You sort of have to play the big spotlight game as well. And as I said, I think you can do it in a way that's creatively rewarding. I think with things like The Flash, like, to take 2 steps back, when they came to me and said, hey, would you like to pitch for The Flash? Because I was so busy already, I was like, sure, but I'll write a pitch that you're never going to accept, because it'll be the sort of story that I would like to write. And then, of course, they accepted it, which was both wonderful and horrific, because they hadn't the time to do it. But to the point I'm making, if you can find those opportunities, then you can play both games at once. You can tell the sorts of stories that you want to tell. You can be creatively rewarding. You can exercise your own interests and ambitions and preoccupations.
I talk to a lot of creators who say that it's really important to have the power to say no. Like, it gives you a lot of power, because it makes you more desirable, makes you more like the optics of it all. The tricky thing, of course, is when you say no, you don't know the next yes is going to be afforded to you. Will you have that opportunity to say yes again? So it's like you have to balance that stuff. I mean, that's the tricky thing about all this, right? Is like, it's easy to say, oh yeah, Si's just got this great mix where he's writing, 2 for-hire books, and he's got 2 creator-owned or like original books, and then he's also got like the Constantine book, which is somewhere in the middle, where it's like a little bit for me and a little bit for them. And he's got 2 parts, and that 1 part in the middle. That's just his formula. But you couldn't have concocted that formula. That was because at least you were offered opportunities you couldn't resist, like you said earlier, right? So it's like you have to find balance within the chaos almost.
Absolutely. And there will be times like now when there's too much. And it's, by the way, the worst thing a freelancer can do to complain about having too much work, because we have all gone through those periods when there's not enough. I kind of hate, I think it's right, by the way. I think you're absolutely on the money. This business with they won't respect you until you say no. I mean, that's probably true. It's something that a lot of the kind of long in the tooth big 2 creators have told me. Stop doing what they want, start kicking off, start saying, no, I won't do that, and they'll start really respecting you, and that's how you'll get the big books. To which I'm like, fuck it. That's horrible. That's not how you make creators feel valued. It is surely somebody's job to say, well done, you're doing good, and we'll keep hiring you. And I've been lucky in that all the line editors I've worked with in the X office and in the Flash office are wonderful people who recognize that creators, writers and artists alike are not robots yet. They're not AI so far. And in fact, let's be blunt, we're probably quite needy people who need to be told, well done, you're doing a good job. And so we get that from them, and they're very good at that, at the same time as steering you creatively and supporting you and all the rest of it. But I wish there was a little bit more outreach that was of a purely celebratory form. And I'm aware this all sounds very needy and thin-skinned, and it is. I make no bones about that. I'm a writer. I need validation. The problem is, because they're not sharing numbers, nobody's getting in touch with you and saying, well done, this sold X number of copies. You were in the top 100 or the top 50 or the top 10 or whatever it is. In fact, in recent experience, most of the editors don't even get numbers. It's just sort of the top brass who do. You don't have any real metric for the success or otherwise of your work, other than to go on fucking Twitter, whatever it's calling now, where you get, at best, a skewed version of the sort of the fan reaction, because the people who are talking about it are, by definition, the people who care so very much about it that they're skewing to one or the other extreme. But also frequently a completely wrong view of what's going on out there. If you have no coalface from which to gain your sort of spiritual pat on the back, then when you, like, going into the X office, right? It's a dream come true. You're working with all those fantastic characters, accessing all these really important metaphors. It's creatively very rewarding. The editors are wonderful, genuinely wonderful people. But day one, sitting down to write your script, that you're going to get death threats. You're going to get people DMing you to say that you're the worst person in the world. And that's just shrug, normal. And that's weird. That's a really strange state of affairs. And I guess there are like these three weird tracks. Like, if you're in publishing, if you're the publisher or the editors, whether you care deeply about the characters and the IP and the product and the stories and the tone and all the rest of it or not, and in my experience, most of the editors do care because they were fans before they became editors, irrespective of how much you care, your job is to keep the wheels moving. It's a production line. Grind, 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 grind. You can pause and love it and pour some energy into it, but you're doing 1,000 things. They're all overworked. They're all underpaid. They have literally 1 billion titles that they have to usher out the door. And as soon as they're out the door, forget it. Turn to the next one. Grind, grind, grind. And then on the bottom, you've got the readers. And I like to believe that most of the readers are picking up their books and reading them and enjoying them and smiling while they drink their coffee and then going to work and maybe thinking about it over the course of the day, but not like living it, not burning with rage or joy, just enjoying it. It's entertainment. But the ones to whom we have access as creators are the ones who live it, who breathe it. And so you've got this sort of weird, as a writer, you've got this weird rock and a hard place. And the rock is frequently given the appearance of pure indifference, and the hard place is given the appearance of pure fanaticism. And how the fuck do you reconcile those two things in a way that allows you to feel, I'm doing something valuable, I'm doing something important, I'm doing something I believe in? And those are all quite important things to me as a writer. I become more and more aware of this the older I get. I suspect for a lot of my colleagues who were really big superhero fans before they became writers, it's enough to write the characters and to tell great adventures and to sort of exercise the kind of pure swashbuckling fun of it all. But I can't do that, and I wouldn't want to do that. And I struggle, the older I get, to find a thing in those stories that makes me feel like they're valuable. And that's, again, the tail end of a long and onerous period of crunch where I feel flirting with burnout slightly and just needing to sort of down tools a little bit on the whole kind of, especially on the X world. where I've loved my time there. I think I've said some important stuff, but I'm just bruised. I'm really bruised.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I had Jonathan Hickman on the podcast, I think right after House of X and Powers of 10, and he said something along the lines of every X-Men fan has their own favorite character, and they all believe that they should have their own solo title, basically. And I mean, here's the thing. I didn't know Azazel had super fans until yesterday.
I think to jump on that really quickly without wanting to interrupt, he doesn't. He has suddenly people who care because they don't like the idea of two women having a baby together, and if the only way that you can legitimately object to that is that you have to suddenly be Azazel's biggest fan, then you're already on the losing side of this argument. And I'm sorry. So anyway, carry on.
Jason Fleming is listening to this podcast and crying right now because he played him in X-Men First Class. But it's a very interesting position because it's like, okay, so when I first talked to you, it was 2017, which feels like a lifetime ago, I have to say. Mm-hmm. It was like, that was a pandemic ago, and it was 6 years ago, which means it was 1,000 years ago. And you were just doing Angelic, your Image series with Casper Wingard. And it's interesting to think about that, because like right then you were doing that. I think you were either coming off Cry Havoc or you were still on it. You were doing you had done the Spire. And so like you were in a completely different phase in your career. And the natural progression is you do those things, you do some big two stuff. It helps lift up books like Damn Them All. It helps lift up books like Coda. It helps lift up books like Step by Bloody Step. And that's the progression you take. And the thing is again, we're not trying to make it seem like you're like the most oppressed person ever, but you know, death threats are death threats. The thing is there is a cost to it. And it's like sometimes you have to negotiate these things that you never planned on negotiating as you go down this path. And like, frankly, it's like the X-Men fans are very, very serious. And a lot of, I really love Wally West, but I'm not like the type of person who's like, this family has to be 100% happy 100% of the time. And I think there are some fans like that. And so like trying to find a balance where you maintain your sanity, tell the right story, and also don't have your DMs filled with nonsense. I mean, like that, they don't teach that in writing school, I don't think.
No, I mean, there's an awful lot of stuff that we have to do that they don't teach. I mean, we'll come to this later, but the creator-owned side of it, you end up having to do an awful lot of marketing, and none of us got into writing comics to be marketers. But I think there's a little bit of a, like the X world in particular, and I may be sort of driving off down a dark highway with no real idea where I'm going with this one, but I think it's a little different in that the IP is so culturally defined by the metaphors,
right,
that it has always spoken to, that it does speak most powerfully to people who feel othered, disenfranchised, minority, whatever, people who feel like they need that metaphor to speak to the struggles that they've had in their life. And that's beautiful and should really be celebrated. The flip side of that coin is that those people will probably invest far more identity into those characters and into those situations than other IPs, question mark. We'll come back to the flash of it all in a moment. But it follows that it's probably a lot easier to outrage somebody accidentally. And over the past 3 or 4 years that I've been working in X books, there are people out there who they will write a review, for instance, that starts by saying this was a really great issue and I believed everything it said and it worked really nicely, and then spend 300 words describing why I'm a racist or a misogynist or a transphobe or a whatever. And that shouldn't bother me because I disagree that I am any of those things. I know I'm not those things. And it's not about reputational damage. It's not about the fact that this is sort of signaling and damaging me in some sort of online sphere. I don't give a fuck about all that stuff. This is very honest and probably a little bit needlessly honest. It makes me really sad that people think I'm a bad person who has those views. It stays with you. It shouldn't. I should be reading the good reviews or not reading them at all. Apropos prior conversation about we have no metric for success. So of course we read our reviews. We all pretend we don't, but of course we do. I should be reading the reviews taking the good feedback, celebrating the fact that people's lives seem to be being touched, enjoying the fact that people are thanking me, engaging with the positivity. But to know that there are people out there who believe you are a racist or a homophobe, that's horrible. And I'm not claiming that I deserve special sympathy for that, because I would far rather the sympathy was going to the minority groups that I'm trying very hard to represent in a sensitive and empowering way. But it's hard. And as I said, I'm tired and quite bruised. And then to your point about the Flash side of it, or you're so right, that the difference there is that over the years, these characters have been built up into this really charming, loving, quite stable family equilibrium. And the run that preceded mine by Jeremy Adams is just top comics, top superhero comics. Everything you want if you love action, adventure, people being the best people they can be, heroic ideologies, people being role models, that sort of stuff. All the things that like the best superhero comics are, that's what it was. But that cannot persist indefinitely.
Right.
You can't tell stories that don't have some sort of cracks and conflict. So yes, I got quite a lot of grief from people who assumed that the only recourse I had was to break it all up and to make these characters unhappy. People really get sad when they assume it is your job to make their beloved characters sad, to make them unhappy. And well, it'll probably have a happy ending. You just have to be a bit patient. Do you know what I mean? There needs to be a little bit of a journey to get there. But people don't like that notion. They like the fact that today Wally West is happy and he has a beautiful, loving wife and a beautiful, loving family, and he's the fastest man in the world and he can deal with any crisis and blah, 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 blah. Don't rock that boat, Si. And then DC's like, okay, you've got 12 issues, but don't rock the boat. They didn't say that. In fact, they said rock the boat as hard as you fucking want. But it's a trick to do it in such a way that it doesn't offend.
I mean, it's tricky too, because it's like I always think of Spider-Man. Spider-Man's a perfect example because, like, based off of the discussion about the character, everyone just wants him to be married, Peter Parker to be married to Mary Jane, and they just want him to be happy. But it's just like, if you just did a comic of that, like, what is that? That's just like a slice of life comic that I don't think anyone, I'm not saying that nobody wants that. I would read that, but I don't think it's what they really want in their heart of hearts. It's an idea of what they want. And like, that's the tricky thing. I did actually want to ask though, I kind of get this feeling, like, did you read there was the Taika Waititi quotes that came out about Thor Ragnarok, about how basically he went on a podcast, Smartless, where he talked about how he took Thor Ragnarok because he needed to like feed his family basically, and that he didn't have like a significant connection and he didn't really like Thor going in, and he just had to find his own story in there. And I'm not saying that you're necessarily that, but sometimes I've gotten the impression that Damn Them All and Hellblazer and Coda and Step by Bloody Step, those are more natural for you than taking on The Flash or taking on X-Men. I know that you appreciate these characters, but is it more about you trying to find your way in than like you expressing this deep, deep fandom you have for these characters when you're writing them?
Yeah. In a nutshell, I did not grow up with Marvel and DC characters. I had no stored up reservoir of love for them. Didn't discover them until I was already writing punky, black-hearted, cynical British comics for 2000 AD. I will actually do you one better. I think the best superhero stories are written by people who were not fans before they became writers.
Sure.
And I think that this is not always true, and I will immediately regret saying that, because a lot of the best superhero stories are written by people who are self-described fans. So take
some of the best, for sure. Some of the best. I mean, it's like you can kind of get the feel that it's like when you read Mark Waid's stuff, it's like you read Kingdom Come, and you're like, this is awesome because like he knows everything there is to know about DC stuff. But sometimes like you read like New X-Men by Grant Morrison, Frank Quitely, and everybody else, and like that was a group of people who were bringing a completely different sensibility to those characters, and it worked really well because of it.
I think there's a difference between affection and reverence. Let's put it like that. I think you can have stored up affection for characters, IP, and still be able to tell quite radical, interesting, valuable stories about them. I think if you have reverence for these characters and their status quo, especially, it's probably dog shit. It's probably not going to be worth anything, because you'll be spinning in circles, returning to the same point always, afraid to do anything new or different, afraid to rock the boat. And that's, I guess, the tension that I've been yammering on about, because a lot of the fans do want that.
Right.
They do want that. They want you spinning in circles and returning to the status quo, or at least they believe they do. And I guess that's where I sort of step outside this whole paradigm, this notion that what fans really want is familiarity. I don't think they do. I think that's what they think they want.
To go back to Spider-Man, I brought this up recently on the podcast, but Dan Slott once told me that he got like horrible hate mail for when he did Superior Spider-Man, when he killed off Peter Parker, killed off the brain of Peter Parker, the spirit of Peter Parker, and injected Otto Octavius in there. And everyone's like, no, this is terrible. How dare you? And then when that run was finishing, people are like, why are you getting rid of this? This is awesome. And it was the same people. And it's just like, sometimes people don't know what they want. I mean, isn't that the point of being a storyteller, is telling something? Like, one of my favorite stories I've read or watched or engaged with in the last like 5 years is Station 11, the HBO Max series. And like, I watched that during the heart of a pandemic, a show about like the world ending from a pandemic. And it was like the most hopeful thing I've seen in forever. And I absolutely loved it. And I wouldn't have asked for that, but it was what I needed and wanted without even realizing it. And sometimes that's what you got to find, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I have a very similar story. When I did X-Men Legacy all those years ago, the first issue was just despised, like the worst reviews I have ever seen. I got 1 out of 10 from like 4 or 5 of the big outlets. And then 24 issues later, the exact same outlets, the exact same reviewers were saying, Marvel, how could you possibly cancel this amazing series? It's so important. It's so valuable, blah, blah, blah. And it's exactly what you describe. It's that, actually, slight swerve. There is an extra variable here, which is the retailer. I often think that as a writer, my real audience is not the reader, it's the retailer, because that's who orders it. If I can't persuade the retailer to have it in their store, then the readers don't even get to enjoy it either way. So first port of call, find the thing the retailers want. The problem is that historically, and this is a little different today, thank goodness, but historically, the tedious, granular realities of the distribution network, which is not where you thought this conversation was going to go, so I will keep it quick. The tedious realities of the distribution network are such that retailers are only ever like one bad week away from collapse. They have to know exactly how many copies of any given book are likely to sell before they order it into their shop, because they only have often like between an issue 1 landing and an issue 2's final order cutoff, you get like 3 days. So unless you are very, very careful about your margins, you're fucked. It follows that historically retailers have quite sensibly leaned towards things that they recognize, things that seem familiar, things that they can say, it's got this writer, it's got this artist, it's about this character, it appears to be a retelling of a story that we told 20 years ago. We know exactly which of our regulars are going to buy it. We can guess that maybe another 20% of people who walk in are going to buy it as well. So we'll order this many copies, safe as houses. That stifles all creativity, all recklessness, all interesting stuff. And you end up normalizing the notion that what people really want is familiarity, when actually I suspect they don't. I think when people pick something up and it's startling and interesting and challenging and clever and not what they were expecting, I think that can create a far bigger emotional response than playing the hits.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Looking for the right place to read digital comics? You can find it at Omnibus. Omnibus is a modern digital comic book store and reader app carrying your favorite single issues, volumes, and omnibuses all day and date. It's just like a comic shop where you pay per book, but digital. Omnibus has even upped its game lately, as they've added a web reader in store on top of its iPad version, with iPhone and Android coming soon. Looking for an ideal digital comic store, but with an excellent shopping and reading experience, one that uses novel discovery features to help fans find their next new favorite book? and one that features many of the best comics and publishers in comics today, including publishers like Image, Boom, Dark Horse, and more. You can find all that on Omnibus. Visit the web store or download the app today at omnibus.app. And now, back to the show. I mentioned earlier that I had a theory that you didn't really have that connection to superhero stuff. My other theory is I don't know if this is a real thing. It might just be a World War Z thing, but there was this idea that I learned about in World War Z that was about the 10th man. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie or read the book, but the idea is basically that in like it was in a military setting, that if there's 9 people in a 10-person group and that all agree, the 10th person's responsibility is to be the person who disagrees and deliberately does so. And I remember writing about Way of X when it first launched. It was during this period of Krakoa where everything was positive, everything was good, and it felt like you were that 10th man. You were the one who was deliberately taking that contrarian position. And I feel like even when I read The Flash, like I'm going to read the first line from the 3rd issue because I feel like this is kind of a funny it's a very funny mission statement in a weird way. So it's Wally West saying, so we're going with spooky Speed Force stuff and leaving it at that, right? And then like it ends up not being that. And the funny thing is like that's where a lot of those stories normally go. It's just like, oh yeah, it's just like goofy, weird ass Speed Force stuff and whatever. But you're like, no, we're not leaving it at that. I feel like a lot of times when I read your superhero stuff, and I mean this for the better, it's a contrarian take.
Yeah. I think it's probably a British take if I'm generalizing rottenly. You know, we're very good at approaching something that appears to be purely positive and aspirational and saying, hang on a minute, there's a hole in the middle of that. You haven't seen the cracks, have you? And then leaning into them, making the bug into a feature. That's sort of been every superhero book I've ever found that I've ever written and enjoyed writing. Which is quite a big qualification, has always been about turning the bug into a feature. It's a good approach when you get, in inverted commas, invited, in brackets, required to join into one of the big summer events. You know, hey, we're really loving what you're doing in insert title here, but just so you know, 5 issues have to be based in the midst of this big event. And you panic because what the fuck? It's an event. The main story is being told in the main book. Everybody's just going to be spinning their wheels, doing little nonsense stories. It all feels quite throwaway and forgettable. But if you can take a look at the main event and say, there's a hole, there's something that the main writer hasn't thought of, that's my story. I'm plugging the hole. Everybody will thank me because I'm plugging the plot hole that they hadn't noticed. And also, it suddenly makes my story much more interesting and much more important. Because there's this, as I'm sure you know, there's this sort of nonsensical notion in shared world comics of relevance and importance. I'm not reading this because it's not important to the big picture. Actually, as I say all this, it occurs to me that, and I hadn't really thought about this before, that's exactly what Alan Moore did with Saga of the Swamp Thing during the first crisis, right? There's that whole bit where they go to the Watchtower and it's like, all of you colorful superhero people can deal with the big real world stuff. We're going to go do the spiritual stuff over here because you haven't thought about that. And it's just a way of saying we're playing your game, but we're plugging your holes. So you don't need to think about us. We're going to go and play over here and leave us alone for now. And that seems like a really smart approach because it's playing the game, but also creatively ring fencing your own little arena.
I always find tie-ins to be really fascinating. I also think it's funny that so you did Sins of Sinister with Kieran Gillen and Al Ewing and the variant artists who worked on that as well. And the funny thing about that is I think all 3 of you are very good at tie-ins, and maybe this goes back to the British of it all, but I also think all 3 of you are good at identifying that hole. And Sins of Sinister in some weird way is kind of a mini event about the hole.
There's a joke in there somewhere, isn't there?
I know, it's terrible. It's terrible. But I mean, you know what I'm saying, though? It's just it is interesting where it's Sins of Sinister is just kind of that contrarian take of what happens if everything goes wrong and basically the biggest asshole in the world is running things extended out 10,000 years. And it's really fascinating to look at that book because of it, because all 3 of you do have that perspective. It is funny that all of you are really, really good at tie-ins. Maybe it's just because you have that perspective.
I think it's, I mean, certainly in Al's case, we came through 2000 AD, which sort of, encourages that sort of counterintuitive, slightly contrarian view. And Kieran's in the same sort of headspace as well. With Sins of Sinister, I mean, logistically speaking, it almost, not entirely, but it certainly was a major feature that we were all on the same time zone. So we could just spend all day jamming about it while the rest of the ex-office were asleep, and then sort of present our noodlings in the afternoons. It's a lot of fun working with those guys. It's a lot of fun working with all of those people. I've had such a great few years, and will miss it intensely, because you sort of, as we all know, sitting writing is a very solitary job. So if you can be part of any sort of community, and we all have our sort of Slacks and our various little email chains and various different apps that allow us to communicate with our colleagues. And that was one of them. If any of us was having a silly day, we'd just post pictures or whatever. It became quite a friendly group as well as a very creative group. And I've spent some time doing writers' rooms for TV. Sort of surprised myself at how much I enjoyed that, because I always thought I was quite a solitary writer. But I feel like one of the things I'm quite good at, to my surprise, is chucking ideas into an exciting feeding frenzy and sort of encouraging them. Not this. Basically, if you have any sense of ownership over ideas, you're going to be shit at this. That sort of communal thing where the outcome becomes greater than the sum of its parts. If you're remotely egotistical or remotely possessive, it all goes wrong.
Weren't you the person who came up with the suits of Sinister?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like you chuck that in there, and then next thing you know, Stasis is in X-Men.
Yeah, and Mother Righteous, all these big, and that's the where it falls down is when somebody tries to take ownership of this stuff, and I don't, because I can see my thumbprints in everything, but I would never say that was entirely my idea, that was my one, because A, my memory's for shit, and I might be wrong, and B, it's not any one thing. These things they're like galaxies, that gravity, the swirling nebulae sort of clumping together, and it might be somebody chucks in a word and somebody says this and somebody says, what about that? And that gets rejected because it didn't work, but it's okay because it still creatively triggered somebody else to say, oh, what about this? And before you know it, you've got something that's completely different from where you started and completely different from where you thought it was going to go, but is great. And that's a really exciting process. And I'm not saying I would want to do that all the time, because it does get exhausting. And you do occasionally want things to go your way, and you get a little frustrated at the fact that it's drifting in that direction, even if it is better. But my God, it's thrilling when it works.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's interesting about, like, you did X-Men Blue Origins. And I mean, I don't normally talk spoilers, but I feel like it's kind of difficult to not talk about this without talking about what actually happens in it. It's like that comic made a long-standing theory, apparent desire of Chris Claremont, which I have to admit, I didn't even know existed. I am an X-Men fan, but I also am not like very like locked down on all of the details about what everyone wanted throughout history and everything. But they revealed that Nightcrawler's actual parents were not Azazel and Mystique, but Mystique and Destiny. And the funny thing about that is that, to me, is a story that makes sense for you to write, in the sense that Nightcrawler has been your character throughout this era. But at the same time, I imagine, I'm not saying you didn't come up with it, but that, given how the X Office works, like that beat coming up now may have originated from any number of people. It could have been you. It could have been Jordan White. It could have been anybody.
So it's an interesting point. The truth is that as long as I've been part of that group, it's been something that we've sort of openly talked about. Wouldn't it be great if we got the opportunity to do this? I wonder if Marvel would let us. I wonder how it would fit into the story.
Are we talking like basically since you started on Way of X?
Yeah, but never like in a sort of let's do it. It was just a sort of, hey, I wonder if now's the time. I wonder if they would let us. It's always just been a sort of floating thing. Because of the brief that I was given when I first came in, which was very much to do with the fact that in Hickman's run, Nightcrawler had declared, I'm going to create a mutant religion. That was very much the focus of my first run. Meanwhile, Mystique was very busy doing other things elsewhere, eventually became part of Kieran's core story. So we were sort of positioning these things as our stories needed, but keeping an eye on the chance that maybe the stars would align. And then when we came to doing Uncanny Spider-Man, which is about as close as I've ever come to doing like a solo book with Nightcrawler, I realized that this was the opportunity. You know, if finally we could have a story that focused on him and her and almost nobody else. And this is where it gets a little bit funky. Whereas it would have been quite nice to make the revelations that came out in this X-Men Origins book part of the core story of Uncanny Spider-Man, after a lot of discussion, and I think this is the right call, we felt that if there was a way of kind of having our cake and eating it, by which I mean having it make sense in the context of the plot of Uncanny Spider-Man, but also permitting it to be its own artifact,
right,
then it would allow, there's a bigger conversation to have here, and I'll come back to that. It would allow people to pick it up and read it and enjoy it and to understand and hopefully appreciate its importance and its value without having had to wade through Uncanny Spider-Man, let alone the rest of the X stuff that I've done, let alone the whole of the Krakoan era. So that's why, by the way, the mechanism in that book, there's a little character, sort of annoying little Greek chorus goblin character who pops up to his job is basically to say, it's okay. You don't need to know a bunch of stuff. Just go with me on this. You don't need to understand the background. Just work with me. And it's sort of quite predictable how the reaction to that has gone. The people who know it all and have been following it every step of the way are like, why did I need that guy? He was so annoying. What the fuck was he doing in my book? Get rid of him. And everybody else is like, oh, he's quite useful. He actually told me that I didn't need to worry about it. But the bigger problem, I suppose, classic Spurrier waffle tangent here, is that, and this is, by the way, the reason that Uncanny Spider-Man is what it is, apropos the whole spinning in circles, going back to status quos of it all, when you've spent, 4 years since Hickman created this Krakoa project, doing what I maintain is one of the most interesting pieces of science fiction, social world building that has happened in recent comics, in any medium, arguably. It doesn't matter how brilliant it is, how much of it has been great, how much of it's been shit. None of that matters. If you're the publisher, you start to say, nobody can jump aboard this train because it's been traveling for 4 years and there's an awful lot of stored up backstory. How do we reconcile that? So with Uncanny Spider-Man, it was very important to sort of narrow the focus and allow people to just jump aboard with a very simple come aboard elevator pitch. Nightcrawler is on the run. He's hiding out in a Spider-Man suit, trying to avoid the big problems that mutants are going through. Off you go. You don't need to have read 4 years worth of comics. But you can understand the anxieties that the bosses would have about this perpetual steamroller of an idea, because it's very difficult to encourage people to jump aboard. I don't know how you reconcile that. I don't know if it should have just been that we kept going and said to people, there's plenty of jumping on points, just keep going with it, or whether there's some sort of crash back to the status quo at all. I don't think that's what they're going to do, for what it's worth, but I don't know. So
the dark reality is I don't think anybody knows the answer to these questions. And that's part of the reason why it's like such a challenge, is that, like, you know, the old idea is that, like, when you restart these things, you give them a jumping on point, but also you're giving them a jumping off point. And so it's like, how do you balance those two sides? But I have to say, I mean, just to transition us, I lured you on here by saying I want to talk about Damn Them All, and then I have not talked about Damn Them All at all. I think it's interesting. You come in, you write a bunch of superhero stuff, but you're also doing these books that, at least from the outside, seem like pretty successful. Like Step by Bloody Step seemed like it was a very beloved release. And thankfully put Matthias up there as like god of art, as everyone should recognize. But then on top of that, like Damn Them All was originally a miniseries, and then it got elevated to an ongoing, and it seems like it's gotten a lot of big fans. I am curious as to like beyond visibility with like readers and retailers and publishers. Like, do you think that writing superheroes has impacted the stories you sort of tell for yourself, like Damn Them All or Coda or Step by Bloody Step in a meaningful way? Or is it those distinct flavors where you don't really have a meeting in the middle or like influence from one to the other?
You mean in terms of sort of the ongoingness or otherwise of it all?
Like, do you think that would Damn Them All be what it is if you hadn't written Hellblazer and
Um, in the case of Hellblazer, no, because it was very much a sort of bitter, black-hearted reaction to Hellblazer being cancelled.
yeah.
So that's there's a direct line from one to the other. But in terms of the sort of the craft, the formalism of it all, I don't think so. It's a good question. It's not something I've pondered.
There's one thing I think. Would the data pages of Damn Them All existed without the X-Men
Oh,
stuff?
that's a really smart. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. No, that was something I just unapologetically cadged from the X books because it was such a fun thing to be able to do, as long as you don't rely on it too much. And that's a problem some of the way. Like in movies, we talk about the theory of diegesis, which is the difference between whether normally it's about sound. Is a piece of music playing over the top of the music, or is it in the scene? If it's diegetic, it's being experienced by your characters. If it's non-diegetic, it's outside. It's only being experienced by the viewer. You can treat extraneous data page type stuff in the same way. So in some cases, it's purely for the reader. And if you lean on that too hard, it trips the reader up. It breaks the flow. It causes everything to sort of slow down, and it ends up feeling a bit cheap. If it's diegetic, if it's the sort of thing, like for instance, a couple of times I've done things where, to give you an example, a character's standing listening to somebody talking on a radio, and then the screen shuts off, and then the next page is a page of transcript. And it's what that person is listening to during that conversation. And then the story picks up again. And that's just a way of saying, here is a page that would be boring as fuck if I got an artist to draw it. So let's just enjoy the fact that it's pure text. And you can sort of play with that whole tell, don't show thing that has always been a little bit of a joy of mine. With Damn Them All, it's a neat way of initially introducing each of these demons. So Damn Them All, for the uninitiated, is a story about the 72 evil spirits of the Ars Goetia, demons essentially, being released into London and what happens next. And they're exciting and fun, and they've been around in sort of grimoires since medieval times. And so it's kind of fun every time one pops up to just pause and have a little sort of introductory spiel about that character. It's not particularly important to the story, but it's colorful and it gives you a lot of juice. And just to break my own argument, we realize at the very end of the story that it is totally diegetic. These are the papers of a dead character, which one of our other characters reads towards the end of the story. And so it sort of all comes together in a way that makes it hopefully seem quite relevant and important that these things are there. But you must remember, I come from prose writing. I was a prose writer long before I was a comics writer, and the itch is always there to sort of drop in these little bits of pure text. I think the problems, as I say, begin when you start relying on that, when you start asking readers to divide their attention and give equal importance to the data page as to the comics, and that's not what they're there for.
I feel like, to emphasize the diegetic nature of it, I feel like you do an unusually good job of connecting those. It's funny I call them data pages. I mean, they're from the what is it, from Alfie's papers and everything, and they're like breakdowns on all these different things. Mm-hmm. They help you understand these different elements, but also there are some times where it almost immediately tethers into the story. Mm-hmm. And like those ones I'm kind of like, it's funny how there's like scenes from movies that are now GIFs in my mind because I've seen them as GIFs so many times. It's like Antonio Banderas reacting in Assassins to getting like an email and sitting back and stuff. I'm kind of like that as I read some of these data pages and I get to the point where they like really connect. And I think that they add a lot, and I think you do a very good job of meshing those together. And like it also, the thing about it too is because it is the papers of Ellie's deceased uncle Alfie, they do have the weight of personality to it. It's not just like, I say this with respect, and I love this bit, but it was like, I think it was in House of X where there was like the breakdown of all the different Omega mutants, and I'm like, yeah, this is awesome. I love seeing this, but it's also not personal, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's pure information, and I think there's a time and a place for that, but with something like Damn Them All, which is so much about voice, I think the saving grace of those data pages, which I refer to them as well, by the way, they're not, but let's call them that, is that they are presented in somebody's voice. It's essentially a guy's diary. He sat down and written about all these things that he's experienced over the years in his own quite idiosyncratic way. So you don't feel like it's just, a fucking Star Wars crawl at the beginning of a movie telling you stuff. You feel like there's actually a little bit of personality behind these things.
Well, and also it like makes this character who has, spoilers for literally basically the first scene of the comic, a character that's been dead the entire time the comics existed. He's present in the story through these pages, and you have a better idea of kind of like the roots of Ellie. Actually, I did want to say something. You mentioned Uncanny Spider-Man as being like your kind of solo book. I think it's funny. Even when you write solo books, they're not really solo books. I kind of feel like this is like an Ellie book, but is it really just an Ellie book? Not really.
No, you've got the reason I describe it as that is because there is no often exhausting need to keep multiple sub threads spinning all at once, which is what I think harms so many team books. The notion that every single member of the team has to have a plot on the go all at once. And, if you do it well, they will, but a couple of those will probably be whether or not to eat a ham sandwich or a cheese sandwich, and that's okay, as long as there's a couple of big plots. But when you're dealing with a book that is in inverted commas a solo book, it doesn't matter how many supporting characters you've got, it doesn't matter how many people you're actually following around. It's generally speaking one thread. There's always going to be subplots and stuff bubbling away, just to completely torpedo my own argument. But yeah, it's about being economical with the number of things grabbing your attention. With Damn Them All, in a way, it's a book about loss. It's like the whole thing is about a woman who does not deserve to be in the shadow of somebody who's dead because she's brilliant. She's a lot cleverer and more human than he ever was. And yet, because he saved her at a young age, she's got all this sort of stored up worship for him, even though he was clearly an awful person. And again, spoilers, that all gets challenged quite majorly towards the end of the first arc, when she realizes that this whole thing that she's been trying to undo in his name is sort of wasn't helped by him in the first place, to put it lightly. So yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic. There's a version of this where we can just be blunt about it and say that Alfie Hawthorne, the dead character, is basically John Constantine. It's a book which begins with John Constantine dying and everything going to shit because he's dead, and then somebody has to step up and plug the hole. What's interesting is that even though the idea emerged very much as a reaction to the end of my tenure on Hellblazer, it hasn't ended up feeling too much like a Hellblazer book. It's much more brutal, I guess. It's much more sort of personal and personable. There's a little less, it still sounds weird for such a cynical book, there's a little less sort of arch cynicism. Whereas Constantine is usually somebody who will stand at the back of a room and let the marionettes dance and let everybody else murder each other and then go away and feel a bit bad about it while smoking and drinking Guinness and then promptly forget all about it. Ellie, the main character in Damn Them All, is the person in the middle of it all, breaking heads open and then counting the cost of it on the way home on the bus. And that's quite a different headspace to try and occupy as the writer, I think it's probably harder space to occupy because it's so much more involved. It's so much more invested in the action of the comic. Damn Them All, by the way, though I am extraordinarily proud of it, and of Charlie, and of Sophie, and of Jim, is the hardest book I have ever written.
Interesting.
It's just like pissing razor blades. It takes me like 3 weeks to write every issue. And it's partly because it's so dense and so self-referential and recursive. And it's partly because everything that happens with a voice. There's no just sort of let it happen. There's always somebody talking. There's always somebody expressing things that are juxtaposing to what's happening in the image. It's just utilizing literally every tool that I've got all the time. And it's exhausting to write. But it's funny. I was writing Damn Them All at the same time as Coda. 2 books of which I am a very proud daddy. But Coda just flows out of me. It's like I'm barely aware of there being any effort involved at all. And yet, Damn Them All it's like pulling teeth. God, it's so hard. And yet they're both, I think, quite good.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. It's the last month of the year, and Zoop is saving its best for last. Zoop is proud to be the home of the first ever Jack Kirby crowdfunding campaign. Stay tuned for the launch of Kirby and Wally Wood's Sky Masters of the Space Force, the complete Sunday strips. Also, there's still time to support the Conan the Barbarian Colossal Edition featuring the art of John Buscema, Gil Kane, Barry Windsor-Smith, and other legends. Head over to zoop.gg to support the live campaigns and sign up for the ones coming soon. It takes less than 30 seconds to create an account, and the e-commerce style checkout is easy and intuitive. Add multiple rewards and add-ons into your cart, provide some info during checkout, and you're done. No confusing additional steps in finalizing your pledge, and no post-campaign surveys. And of course, every creator appreciates your support. For creators looking to crowdfund your project, Zoop is currently open for submissions. Email them at hello@wearezoop.com to start a campaign. And now, back to the show. It's interesting, so Hellblazer, your run that you did with Aaron Campbell, and that's coming back. I mean, you have a Sandman universe story that's coming up, but I mean, it's different species of Constantine because comics are crazy. Do you think that part of that is because that Constantine run meant so much to you and you've poured so much of yourself into Damn Them All that it's kind of like, I don't know. It feels like the fulfillment of something that was super important to you that you were unable to continue doing. And while Coda was a thing that you created and it didn't have any roadblocks because it was your thing. And so now you're kind of like fulfilling this, but also finding out it's something different. And so maybe that makes it more challenging. I don't know.
I think you're probably bang on the money. It's the critical distance to be able to see all these things going on, which you have and I don't. So yeah, I think that's not far off the mark. The Damn Them All came with a lot of anger and rage and bitterness and all the things that you sort of need anyway to be writing characters like Constantine or Alfie Hawthorne or Ellie Hawthorne. So it all sort of worked quite well. For the record, like the new Hellblazer, which is starting, I think in January, it literally is the continuation of our old run. It's the same.
Oh.
It's the same story. It's picking up right where we left off. So we get to carry on, and that was always sort of bubbling in the background. There was always the chance that would happen. So it wasn't a pure sort of fuck you to DC that I would go away and write a story about this character that I love being dead. It was more of a sort of, I have all this stored up voice, all this sort of Constantine energy in me. I want to tell stories about dirty things happening in the liminal spaces between reality and folklore and magic, ideally in London, where the occult meets crime. And suddenly all that has gone, and I don't know if it's coming back, so I'd better do something with that because it feels valuable. And that's what became Damn Them All. And thank God Charlie Adlard came aboard. Otherwise, it could have gone really horribly wrong if it had the wrong artist attached to it.
I have to say, Charlie and Sophie are just absolutely killing it throughout this book. I mean, it's kind of funny that a guy who did like 188 issues of one of the most popular comics of ever, and I kind of feel like this is his defining work in some ways. Like it looks unbelievable. But I do think it's interesting. Going back to the whole we were talking about earlier, the contrarian take.
Mhm.
It is kind of funny though, because like in a lot of ways, Damn Them All is what is a Constantine story without Constantine? And like that, and also in a weird way, how do you make up for his failings in life?
Yeah, and I think that is an emergent motif, as my old film school lecturers would have called it, that has become quite a big deal in my recent work. Like it hasn't quite become obvious yet, but the current arc of Coda is about the same thing. It's about people learning to live with the gaps in their lives and learning to sort of own them, acknowledge them, and either do everything in their power to fill the gap or to just live with it. And there's a multitude of different ways of dealing with that. But that's for a host of real world reasons I won't bore you with. That's something that preys on my mind a great deal. And it does inevitably trickle its way out into your work. I mean, you could even argue the same thing is going on in Uncanny Spider-Man if you really want to reach. But funnily enough, the Flash arc is about almost exactly the opposite. It's about somebody who has too many things going on and being everything to everybody and just being exhausted and needing to stop. That's again the contrarian of it all, I suppose. The sort of the thing we were talking about before. They asked me to do a run about the fastest man alive. They turned in a pitch in which he is basically required to stop, which you're not supposed to do, but I think it's good.
Two things about that. One, I actually ran into your editor, Chris Rosa, at New York Comic Con, and he had nothing but good things to say. He was so excited about this book. And what's that?
What I was saying before, like Chris is of all the many editors I've worked with, he is the most enthusiastic and encouraging. Like he'll tell you when something is good, and he'll tell you when something's great, and you believe him. And those two things are not always true of every editor you work with. Anyway, that's enough ranting about him. Otherwise, he'll get a big head, but he's great.
The other thing I was going to bring up is I read in this interview about The Flash where you were talking about how you always have too many ideas for the page and you always have to figure out a way to like sort that out. And it was funny reading that where I was kind of like, you got a lot of Wally West in you. You got a lot of like too much for the rest of the world to handle. And so what happens when you both slow down? It seems like in some ways that's kind of you confronting, what if I take these 5 projects on? What happens next? And the answer is you need to find a way to slow down.
Yeah, well, I mean, hell, there's no great mystery to the fact that I've spent the first 20 minutes of this interview telling you how exhausted I am and have too much, and then I write a story about a guy who's trying very hard to be everything to all people, and the cracks start to show. You write what you know, don't you?
I just have a couple more things. I did want to bring up one of my favorite things about Damn Them All is that it is a story about devils, and it is a story about varying people who, by all rights, are not good people. And yet, I kind of feel like no one is necessarily like a pure villain besides like a lot of old rich white guys who are just kind of like
Funny that.
just like taking advantage of everyone. And the funny thing is like the devils, like I deeply sympathize with the devils. Like I'm not going to try to pronounce the devil's entire name, but Glaz, the one that takes the form of the dog. Yeah, that one. Oh my God. The moment, I don't even want to get into it, but like the moment where Ellie makes a bad decision with him, I was like actively like yelling at my iPad because I was reading it on there. I was like, what are you doing? No, no one wants this. And, but it's interesting because it makes it a much richer read because it isn't just a sort, like there's a version of this book that is written by somebody else where it's like a villain of the week type period or a procedural type story where Ellie is just cleaning up a mess of bad devils. And then the fact that it's more complex, like there's a moment in the first issue where, what is it? Andromalius says, sorry for the disturbance. And as soon as I read that, I was like, this book is different in a very interesting way.
Yeah, it really appealed to me to, again, contrarian, to posit a book about demons running around in London, and pretty much the first thing you learn about the demons is that they're not actually that bad. There are far worse people who are manipulating and using them. I mean, to be brutally honest, the origins of the idea, long before the sort of the Ellie Hawthorne and the Alfie Hawthorne of it all became the central story. For many years, I had this. I've always been interested in like medieval magical grimoires, and have copies of the Ars Goetia and the Lemegeton and the Clavicula Solomonis and all of that stuff. And it occurred to me that in a modern mentality, the 72 evil spirits of the Ars Goetia, like people would treat that like Pokemon or like top trumps.
Yeah.
And so originally it was like this sort of dumb, sort of demonic comedy where rich kids were trying to collect as many demons as they can and doing like demon Pokemon fights and stuff. And that's like a fun idea, but it's not a very rich idea. That's like a one shot. And there's still an element of that, but what that idea mutated into is the idea that if you have this incredible resource, essentially 72 divine entities which can pretty much do anything that you want them to do, and they are suddenly loose and, importantly, very ownable, possessable, controllable, manipulatable, then immediately you have an arms race on your hands, and you have an awful lot of people who are trying to control as many of them as they can, and to negate anybody else who has them, and to push harder and faster and further than any of the others. And that's Damn Them All. What's really interesting about Damn Them All, in like the kind of synergy of writer and artist and the way that symbiosis can shape things, is that when I first started pitching the idea, the sort of long-term arc was constantly escalating stakes, where this arms race just gets bigger and bigger and starts to overwhelm the entire globe and ends up being this sort of apocalyptic global catastrophe. And then Charlie came aboard, and Charlie's like, I don't want to draw big monsters and things exploding and the world on fire. I want to draw people in pubs, occasionally punching each other, but otherwise talking and drinking beer and having conversations. And he was right, by the way. He was very right, because that way you get this wonderful disconnect between the sorts of stakes which are glimpsed, just enough that you know how bad it could get, and the very human level of intimacy that we want the story to have, so that we really feel like we're investing in these characters and the things that are going on in their heads. So in story terms, we had to find ways to limit it. We sort of came up with this idea that it's all contained in London, and it starts to leak out, then the whole world's in trouble. So it's all about keeping it in London and trying to maintain it all. And then angels get involved, but they're sort of keeping things contained. And it's fascinating over the course of these longer running projects how the sort of the realities of the day-to-day start to impinge upon the nature of the story, the nature of the plot, the character decisions, in a way that feels quite organic if you're doing it right. And inevitably, to go back to the writer's room of it all, it sort of ends up feeling a bit greater than the sum of its parts, I think. I think it would have been worse if I had done what I originally intended to do and made it into this vast apocalyptic story.
Yeah, I think that it being contained definitely helps, and in multiple ways. I think it's interesting because it's not just contained in London, it's contained in the sense that there's a lot of like kind of small rules. Like Glaz mentions that, like, I love the issue where Glaz narrates, and you get insight into like Glaz knows that there are things that could be done to help Ellie, but the rules do not permit him to do that. It has to be asked. It has to be like guided, and it has to fit within the parameters of how these things work. And it's funny because like in some ways there's the physical confines, but other ways there's like kind of the confines of how, like, was it Ars Goetia? Is that how you pronounce it? Like It's the parameters of how they work and knowing how, like, that's one of the things I think is really fun about Ellie is everyone else is like a hammer looking at a nail, and Ellie is like an unconventional thinker, and that helps her a lot in this situation.
Yeah. The whole thing is, I mean, I love nihilists. There's a reason that so many of my characters are like these people who struggle to find meaning, and in a perfect Spurrier ending, somebody who has spent the entire story saying nothing matters, I'm doing this for myself, ends up accidentally discovering that something does matter, and that's what sort of solves the story.
So I've had this theory the entire time that I would say the core line to the story is it's not about who's the better magician, it's who's the bigger bastard.
Mm-hmm.
My pet theory this entire time is it's not true, but it's not the ultimate truth of the story. And I'm very interested to see how that plays out, but obviously you can't really say much about it. I do also want to say, based on that rationale, I would be like the most useless person in the world. I'm a horrible bastard.
Too many things matter. Yeah, no, I mean, it's maybe there's some wish fulfillment there. Like I'm quite a skeptical person. I've always been I'm a subscriber to 40 Times. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's fantastic. I recommend it to anybody who's interested in weird shit. It's essentially a magazine that rounds up strange things that have happened all over the world, from UFOs and ghosts and Loch Ness monsters to like the Mandela effect and hauntology, and just a whole gamut of exciting, interesting, strange shit. But it does it without a single trace of credulity or sentiment. And the way that I would define it is hopeful cynicism. I would love it if there were ghosts and aliens and Bigfoot, and I'm going to read about them if you put those articles in front of me, because there's a little bit of me that's like, God, maybe this time, but I don't believe it. not unless it's really hardcore proven.
I love the phrase hopeful cynicism. I just want to say,
yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to live. I think, because I have this is one of the core points of the whole Nightcrawler stuff. I have far more truck with hope than I have with faith. I think people can live valuable, perfect, altruistic lives with hope in a way that is much, much harder if all you have is faith. And there's a lot to unpack there, which I'm not going to unpack because it will offend an awful lot of people. So let's swerve that one. But there's an element of, I'm waiting for a miracle. I'm waiting for something truly awesome, something truly transcendental to enter my mind. I'll tell you a dumb little anecdote. I went away with some friends and we stayed in a haunted mansion. We were there for a few nights, and everybody else had gone to bed except me and my mate, and we were downstairs like 4:00 in the morning at this point, drinking whiskey, and he wanted to go to bed, and he's a bit of a coward. He needed me to go up with him.
Sure.
So I was like, fine, I'll walk you to your room. And then I realized that I'd forgotten something back down where we'd been sitting. So I came down into this house on my own. It's huge, Tudor, barn-like kitchen. The fire was just going down. I could have switched the light on, but I just decided not to. And I thought, this is it. If it's going to happen, it'll happen here. Something really shit, scary, spooky. So I sat down at the table and I waited, because in my mind, it doesn't matter how terrifying a glimpse of wonder, the supernatural, metaphysics, ontology, whatever, doesn't matter how frightening that is, because once you've got over the frightened bit, you know that there is this second layer of wonder to the world, which presently I have no knowledge of. And it didn't happen, and I went to bed a little bit disappointed. And then the morning after, I was telling my wife about this, and she's like, you fucking idiot. It's not about ghosts. It's about the psycho clown who stands at the door waiting to come in, which has got nothing supernatural at all, but will kill you. So yeah, I guess a lot of my stories are about these sort of people without meaning looking for meaning.
Yeah. I have a terrible pop culture reference I was going to do. I was trying to look up the exact quote. Somehow I always connect like very thoughtful things with Pixar movies, which is, I don't know what that says about me, but in the first Incredibles movie, there's like the scene where like there's like this little kid who just keeps going by the house and he sees like Mr. Incredible like lifting
Uh-huh.
up a car over his head, and the kid's on this tricycle and he's like, what do you want, like what are you waiting for? And the kid is just saying, I think he says like something incredible, I
Yeah.
guess. And that's kind of you're in that kitchen, you're just waiting for something incredible to happen. And like I don't think there's anything wrong to want. I mean, that's a good thing to want. To close, though, I do want to tie this all back together. It is an interesting point because, you know, you've wrapped up your time in Krakoa. I like how I say Krakoa as if it's like a vacation place. Terrible place to vacation, to be honest. Easy transit, though, if you're a mutant, which is fantastic. Who likes flights?
Great booze.
Yeah, great booze, exactly. And also amazing bartender and Blob. But you're wrapping that. The Flashes in the midst. You really only have, you said, it sounds like 2 projects going, really, like that you have to going forward. I mentioned earlier that when we last talked, a lot has changed since then. I mean, you were at a completely different place in your career. You're at the point where you're probably thinking about saying yes again. What do you want from comics going forward? Like, do you feel like to some degree the mix you've had is what you want for yourself? Or are there itches you haven't scratched quite yet?
It's a very good question. There have already been some offers, which I'm sort of, turning over. I have a sort of standard refrain, and it's one of those ones that it's a do as I say, not as I do. I think it's true. When I'm on my deathbed, looking back at my career, what will be the things that I'm proud of? And they probably won't be the sorts of things that were in response to do you remember at the beginning of this, we were talking about the 2 ambitions, the 2 threads of ambition. The things that I'm proud of won't be the ones that were in response to the first thread. They won't be the little voice that goes, you have to do some Batman. Oh, you haven't done Iron Man yet. You need to do some Iron Man. Get some Iron. They will be questions like, did you believe what you wrote? Were you honest? Did you change anybody's mind? Did you change anybody's life? Did you change your own life? And in some of those answers, I can say yes. Like, won't go into it, but I get enough people coming up to me at conventions whose often very dark places have been brightened or even escaped from, they would say, as a result of things I've written. And I'm always very keen to point out that it's not within my power to save people, but it can sometimes be in the writer's power to inspire people to save themselves. And that's a great privilege. So I think those are the things that will matter, that will stay with me. So I've always sort of got one eye on that when I'm pondering new projects. It's often easier to aspire to those sorts of ambitions with creator-owned projects because you don't have the shackles. On the other hand, if it's all about changing people's minds and lives, it can be quite helpful to start from a position of knowing that there are people who care very deeply about a particular character or a particular place, and then sort of taking them on a journey within the parameters of their own lives. I think what I really need is to slow down for a little bit. I mentioned before, I come from prose, and I've done an awful lot of screenwriting and TV work in the past decade as well. And it's often a warning sign for me that I'm approaching a sort of burnout-y condition that suddenly all I want to do is write prose, or all I want to do is write a screenplay. I've spent the last 5 years researching for a novel, which frankly, it was all self-delusion because I couldn't read novels like I used to without my guilty brain telling me that I should be working or should be doing some childcare. So I managed to trick it by doing a huge amount of research into a subject that I find fascinating, biblical Judea of all things, just so you know. I've become a little bit of an authority on early Christianity. So there you go. Because eventually I quite like to write a novel set in that world. So maybe that will be the next project. But for pure survival's sake, I'm sort of stopping myself from having these conversations, mentally or otherwise.
Sure.
I need to... I just finished writing Uncanny Spider-Man. I've finished writing Coda. Just doing Hellblazer and Flash now, which is like a good amount of fun that I can manage, that I still have the odd week that I can daydream, come up with new projects, get excited about stuff in a way that I haven't been since this period of crunch began. So that's the next step. A little bit of self-care, I think, before launching into the next phase.
I mean, this ties back into something else we talked about in the beginning, which is like, there's like the people, you don't really get a lot of people just saying like, oh, good job. And I do want to say, good job, Si. You've been doing great.
You very much. You will make me cry. I joke you not.
But the thing is, if you're constantly focused on churning, you don't really leave a lot of space for yourself and to like really do something great. And that's not to say that you haven't done great work. I mean, like, Damn Them All, like, spoiler alert, is going to be on my end of the year, like, best comics of the year because I absolutely love it. But at the same time, it's like, if you don't give yourself time to slow down, then you're not going to be able to do your best work.
I think you're half right. On a long enough timeline, you're totally right. It's been 6 months. The reason that I am like a tube bit of string at the moment is because I will not submit something unless it's perfect.
Sure.
To me. So what happens is I don't sleep. I don't see my kids. I don't go to the gym. I don't go for a swim, whatever. I just think and think and think and write and write and write. And it's the thinking that is really quite difficult because in a normal workload, you percolate, your brain has downtime. And so when you need it to deliver ideas to you, they will often just come. I often tell this anecdote. When my daughter was very young, she was very unwell. She did not have a happy entry into the world. And she spent the first 6 or 7 months of her life basically not sleeping. We would be getting about 2 hours sleep a night. And we went potty. Like I know exactly what psychosis looks like because I've been there. We were hallucinating. We were stringing together things in all sorts of twisted logic. And the most frightening thing for me was that I just stopped having ideas. And I have always been somebody who has 80 ideas a day. And, you know, I've never written a comic that I didn't need an extra 20 pages because I have so many ideas that I need to squeeze in. That's I think that makes a better comic. I'd rather have far too many ideas than a paucity of them. But that's always been a thing for me. And they just stopped. And it was like, fuck, that's my career then. I've got a spreadsheet of like maybe 3 years worth of projects that I could toy with that are all sort of worked out. But after that, I'm buggered. And then the very day that my daughter slept for 12 hours straight and my wife and I just collapsed into an exhausted heap and slept for 10, the morning after I woke up and it was like, and they just came straight back again. Sleep is so utterly important to one's mental health, let alone one's ability to have ideas. But yeah, I think a little self-care is probably required to just get that back again.
That is the best advice anyone can get in comics. I can't tell you how many times I've told somebody to go to sleep, that when I know that they absolutely should be. But well, I hope you get the most sleep you possibly can going forward. But Si, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about Damn Them All, everything you're doing right now. I really appreciate you taking the time.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Si Spurrier. You can find him on Twitter and his work in Damn Them All, The Flash, Uncanny Spider-Man, Coda, and the upcoming Hellblazer Dead in America. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at @sketchcomic or following me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Charlie Stickney, Danny Ollie, Tom Drennan, Jeremy Thomas Burke, Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosher, Alan Ellsworth, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Kenny Myers, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Scott Place, Darcy Van Polges, Travis Schmeiser, Tom Evans, Natalie Mockery, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lampert, Brian Holt, Chris Doré, Near Levy, Dennis Hoffman, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Jingo Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Domstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Orens, Scott Carpenter, Rent Narb Studios Comics, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Vandeven, Brian, Submin Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePills, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Nick Bennett, Birdcage Comics Cafe, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Stephen Holt, Philip Myra, Chris Pachala, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Gipp, Sean Kirkham, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Ranwatt, Vita Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Nick Polito, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, Dave Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Adam Highfill, Fiona Staples, Mark Cabinett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comic Star in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Op Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.